Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, returning guest. His name is Walter Herbst. Last name is spelled Herbst. And I conducted 2 interviews with him in 2022, which was very fortuitous because I just reposted them without the knowledge that he had published a new book. So go back. I'll put links to the other 2 interviews we did, and they were very well received. They're both great books. It's a 2-part book or volume book, and the full title is "It Did Not Start with JFK." Volume 1 is the decades of events that led to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and then there's a volume 2 as well. They both have separate titles, which I don't have at my disposal. But his new book, if you're watching this on Rockfin and Rumble and Twitter or X, you will see the new cover. And the full title of this book is Last Resort Beyond Last Resort: The JFK Assassination, the Need to Protect West Berlin, and Why a Second Invasion of Cuba Never Happened. Now, these are topics that are usually not addressed in by other JFK assassination researchers, which I've had many on. I'm close to like 25 different JFK researchers. And I was talking with Walter in the pre-show about all that's happened this year with the JFK. So I think this book is very timely, but he can talk more about that. So Walter Herbst, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you, William. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool. So for people who hadn't heard our earlier discussions, maybe you can talk about your earlier books, what you've been working on. I know your website where people can check out your stuff is herbstbooks.com, which I'll put a link to, and then what led up to the research and writing of Last Resort Beyond Last Resort.
Sure. Well, my first 2 books, it did not start with JFK, was basically an outline of how JFK's or the decades leading up to JFK's assassination, and that his assassination did not occur in a vacuum. And you can go back to the 1920s and see that there was a series of and all based on anti-communism, anti-genetics, class warfare, what have you, that there was a group, right-wing group, that wanted to push their, call it even fascist agenda on the world. And it's through the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, it all built up to the JFK assassination. So when I got to this next book, I was going to write a narrative about the JFK presidency and the assassination, which Last Resort Beyond Last Resort is. And by the way, the title Last Resort Beyond Last Resort comes from William Harvey, who was the CIA's head of assassinations in the late 50s, early 60s. And he called assassination last resort beyond last resort, that you had to exhaust all other alternatives before you even considered assassination. And they did consider assassination. In this case, JFK, they did. Okay, so as I was researching in the assassination and the Kennedy presidency, and the Kennedy presidency is fascinating because even before JFK was elected, when he won the election, Bobby Kennedy was already meeting with Russian intelligence operatives, and he did so through the entire JFK presidency, including during the Cuban Missile Crisis, complaining, or basically almost in tears, that doesn't Khrushchev understand what his brother is going through, that there are people who want to take over the government, what have you. And Khrushchev couldn't understand it. But anyway, so it's just fascinating how that the CIA had to have known this. And the Kennedys were a little bit naive at times in thinking that they could just do stuff like this without anybody knowing about it. Then throughout his presidency, JFK was at war with racist and anti-communist right-wing radical hate groups in the United States who despised him because they considered him a communist in place. And there's nothing he could have done to try and alter what they thought. And, it's well documented. You had the mafia who was upset because Bobby was going after them, even though Joe Kennedy their father had promised the mob that Bobby would leave them alone. and they used various beautiful women to try and blackmail the Kennedys and what have you. JFK fought the Joint Chiefs over Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Berlin, and all they wanted to do was really drop bombs on the Russians or the Chinese. They were ready to do that. Figured at some point we're going to have to do it. We might as well do it when we had an advantage. So anyway, as I was researching, and Cuba's always ground zero in Kennedy assassination discussions, and rightfully so. Everything centered around Cuba. But I came to the realization after just for a few years investigating this, that Berlin constantly came up. JFK, Khrushchev, the Prime Minister of England, Harold Macmillan. It was always, what happened if we do this in Cuba, they'll tell the Russians will move it to West Berlin, and which could have led to World War III. Khrushchev similarly was looking at it and saying, well, if we move take West Berlin, then Kennedy's going to take Cuba. So anyway, I think I'm the first person who has really looked at Berlin and just recognized that this was an important part of the JFK assassination discussion, that it wasn't just about Cuba. And in 1963, everything came to a head, right? Especially, it started with the missile crisis when it was over.
Right.
Right, and that seared, I think, Kennedy and Khrushchev, that it scared them, Kennedy in particular, right? And it's well documented how Kennedy then in the 1960s was trying to normalize relations with Castro through a reporter named Lisa Howard. And he gave his famous American University speech where he talked about we all cherish our children's future, and
still relevant to this day, Walter. Still talking about peace, talking about Russia.
You know, it's so amazing, William, because Ukraine was a very important part of the 1950s and 60s, and that the Ukrainians at that time, or during World War II, were pro Nazi.
Hitler, yeah,
exactly, yeah. Right. So, and after the war, the CIA employed the services a lot of Ukrainians and ex-Nazis, and created these stay-behind armies in Europe that would be a first line of defense against the Russians if they ever decided to move west.
Right, Gladio, right?
Correct, Operation Gladio. Now, that's why Putin today is still calling Ukrainians Nazis.
Yes.
And he's tracing it back to that. And
Banderist, he calls them and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So now where we were worried about the Russians moving west and not having the manpower, say, to stop the Red Army, the Russians have always worried about Western Europe, or include the United States in that, wanting to march east and take over Russia. And so that's really, in my opinion, the big part of the motivation of why he went into Ukraine in the first place. And you could argue that Poland might be next. So yeah, the more things change, the more they remain the same. I mean, nothing really has changed.
It really hasn't. We're still fighting over this. Kennedy was 60 to 63. It's literally 60 years later. We're still fighting. A lot of people in the JFK assassination, or a lot of Americans, don't know about JFK's defense of Berlin and West Berlin, and his speech. The speech there is often overlooked. Maybe you could talk about that history and what happened. I think that was in 61.
No, that
it started 61. In 50. Okay.
I think 61 is when the wall was built.
Okay.
And I think it was in 63 that he went to Berlin, where he said, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Right.
You know, I am a Berliner, meaning we stand in solidarity with you. We're going to protect you. But Kennedy sometimes said things publicly and privately were different, because they had discussions about is Berlin, if we sacrifice Berlin and let it go to the Russians, is that the worst thing? Now, in case your listeners aren't 100% aware of what was happening, after World War II, they divided Germany into sectors. They divided Berlin into sectors, 4 sectors. And France, England, and the United States each got a sector in the West, and the Russians got one sector for the East. But it was all surrounded as part of East Germany. So for us to supply our sectors in West Berlin with food or anything else, we had to either rail it in, truck it in, or fly it in. And Stalin actually put a embargo basically on, or wouldn't allow us to fly in or travel, or excuse me, to travel in. We had to fly in all supplies. The roads were blocked off, and that was the Berlin
Airlift, right? The famous
Yes.
airlift. Yeah.
So that lasted, I think, for about a year and a half or so. But anyway, so it was still a hot button topic as far as, are we being held hostage by this West Berlin? And regardless, I mean, Kennedy was a political animal. In the 1963, he had, he was already looking towards the 64 election. And Cuba was a major part of that, because even though he received a lot of credit for the missile crisis, there were those who really questioned if we did the right thing, because some people thought it was the opportunity to invade Cuba and get rid of Castro, which would have been a mistake, but at the time they didn't know that. So Cuba was still, he thought he had to do something about Cuba, and especially then, right, part of the deal was to remove the missiles from Cuba and to have the UN verify that they were removed by inspecting the sites. And Castro would not let them in. So, I mean, people were looking at this and saying, wait a minute. Meanwhile, Kennedy agreed to remove missiles from Turkey. And then he unilaterally then also removed missiles from Italy. And meanwhile, we're thinking that the missiles are being removed from Cuba, but we're not allowed to verify. So he thought he had to do something in Cuba to, in 1963, not necessarily invade, but at least do something to show that he was standing up to Castro and that he was the man to fight communism in the Western Hemisphere.
Which he was fighting communism around the world. A lot of people leave that out. He wasn't exactly on board with communism, is my understanding.
No, he was not. There were right-wing groups that thought anyone who wasn't ready to just go to war with every communist country then was a communist himself. No, he was, look, he took a stand in Vietnam. He took a stand in Indonesia, Northern Africa, for sure, because Northern Africa was a really hot region at the time during his presidency, because European colonialism was coming to an end, and all of these nations that were never independent were being granted their independence. And it was, as we know today, same thing as you say, things never change. The oil was even more important then than it is today. And so the Russians and the Americans were looking to say, ingratiate themselves with all of these new countries. And, sometimes it was the highest bidder would get the backing of either the United States or the Soviet Union. So it was important, very important.
Yeah, very important. So he's, sometimes they narrow down Kennedy just to like Western Hemisphere, Northern America, but much broader things going on in East and Berlin. And it coincides with the strange movements of Lee Harvey Oswald across the so-called Iron Curtain, right?
Yeah. So Oswald's he's an interesting guy, right? So Oswald, so-called defection, his defection was a CIA operation, maybe naval intelligence, but it was certainly a U.S. intelligence operation. Okay, and there's things that happened while he was behind the Iron Curtain that just defy logic. I mean, he is in contact with people from the West. I mean, it's not direct, but it's indirect. He's photographed over there, and somehow those photos wind up back at the CIA. His notebook's interesting. In his notebook, he has a notation for Boris Pasternak, who is the author of Dr. Zhivago. And so he has Pasternak's address. And Pasternak at the time was like, he was like under house arrest, because Pasternak allowed his novel to be smuggled out to the CIA in the West, and which the the Soviets did not want that book released because it did not put communism in a favorable light. And so somehow Oswald has his address, name, address, a time of to meet, and all of this. And so what's interesting about that too is, so when Pasternak dies, there's a woman named Priscilla Johnson who spends a lot of time at his funeral with the people there, what have you. Now, Phyllis Johnson was a CIA operative. Okay, now she also, keep in mind that when Francis Gary Powers' U-2 plane was shot down in May 1960, that's only like 6 months before the 1960 election that Kennedy won. So it was very much on the minds of everyone at the time when Kennedy became president. And when Kennedy became president, he wanted desperately to meet with Khrushchev, which they wound up doing, and he got blasted by Khrushchev. But he wanted to correct the wrong that he thought Eisenhower did with the U-2 flight, because Eisenhower and Khrushchev were going to meet to discuss a possible nuclear test ban treaty, and then Khrushchev just called it off. They met in France. Khrushchev just ranted and raved, as he was prone to do, and then walked out. So Kennedy was going to fix that. Now, when the U-2 went down, U-2 flight, Priscilla Johnson was a reporter undercover in Moscow, and they called her and they kind of dragged her into the big hall where they were going to announce what happened, and they put her up on the stage, and I think it might even have been Khrushchev's son-in-law, but I'm not 100% sure. But anyway, they kind of humiliated her, and they may have known what she was, and that's why they picked her out. So what makes her important, though, is so when Oswald comes to Moscow, he's staying in the Metropole Hotel. He's waiting for them to decide, can he stay or not stay. He gets interviewed by Aline Mosby, a reporter, who says he's 5'9". No big deal, right? So a couple of days later, Priscilla Johnson interviews Oswald, and she says he's 5'11". And it doesn't seem like that should be that significant, but it is, because when Oswald left the Marines, he was measured as 5'11". His passport said he was 5'11". When he applied to Albert Schweitzer College, which he did while he was still in the Marines, he gave his height as 5'11". But the man who shot Kennedy, or who was shot by Ruby, was 5'9". Wow. And after he returned from Russia, every time he applied for a job interview, he gave his height as 5'9". The only time he ever said he was 5'11" was when he had to reapply for his passport, and that height had to match the first one. Now, there's no shrinking Oswald, and there's some people that think an imposter was there. I happen to think that he was always 5'9". They doctored his info when he left, and they wanted to create the illusion that he was killed by the Russians and came back, which made him the perfect patsy for the JFK assassination. Because you could really make it appear, if you wanted to, like Oswald was 5'11", went to Russia, came back as 5'9", and then was accused of killing the president of the United States. So Priscilla Johnson was the one that saved the day with the 5'11".
Is Priscilla Johnson the same as Priscilla McMillan Johnson?
Yeah.
Okay.
She married a guy named McMillan later.
And her stuff came up in these recent JFK drops as an asset. Like, there was other information before that, but like she put out, I think it was Marina and Lee, this almost War and Peace size book. People don't know this, like 800 pages,
right? Written
by a CIA agent asset. And I think she knew Oswald before November 22nd, 63, right?
Yeah.
So that's what you said, right? No.
Right. She interviewed him at the Hotel Metropole in Moscow.
Wow, amazing, yeah.
But there's more to it than that, right? Well, first of all, Priscilla had tried to get into the CIA in the early 50s and was rejected because she was called herself, she was a World Federalist, which was synonymous with being a Marxist or a communist. But she wasn't the only one. A lot of people at the time, Russia had been our allies during World War II. And so a lot of people assumed that would continue, and they were looking at a kind of like a new world order of everyone kumbaya gets along. But she, in her own words, she said, well, eventually I grew up when she started seeing what the Russians were like, the communists. And so she, they made up a new bio for her. She got into the CIA, and Cord Meyer, right, whose wife, Mary Pinchot Meyer, was JFK's girlfriend and would be shot and killed in 1964 on that path along the canal.
In Georgetown, right?
Yeah, right. So Cord Meyer similarly came out as a World Federalist, had dealings with the communists, realized that they were up to no good, and then he switched, became anti-communist big time. So he got Priscilla into the CIA. Now, after the assassination, you talk about me and Lee, or
it's Marina and Lee, I believe, is the book.
Yeah, you're right. So Priscilla wrote that, but she sat on it for 7 years after she wrote it. Didn't release it, and it's fiction. A lot of it's fiction. Now, her husband, Macmillan, knew George de Morenscheidt, Oswald's buddy. In fact, he spent time at his house and everything else. And Priscilla, and when Stalin's daughter Svetlana defected to the United States, who wrote her biography? Priscilla Johnson.
Wow, there you go.
And she stayed with Priscilla's parents, and of course, Priscilla was probably staying there at the same time. So anyway, as far as Oswald's defection, there's so much, and a lot of it's covered in my book, is that
he's like handled, and so is Marina, from Russia to the United States, because that was Priscilla Johnson Macmillan's claim to fame, is that she knew Marina firsthand and lived with her, spent time with her, so she had very intimate knowledge. Yeah,
she did. I mean, they were like babysitters, and then Ruth. I mean, and when one person ended, another person like Ruth Payne took over and babysat Marina. And Oswald had similar people looking over his shoulder, watching out,
including Payne, Ruth Payne too. Yeah,
including
both
him.
of them. Wow, yeah, wow, amazing.
Yeah. So anyway, so 1963 is when everything came to a head, and how I developed what I think happened.
And you go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. No.
Well, I was going to say, you mentioned an interesting guy. His name is Richard Nagel. And he says that Oswald was an indispensable tool, not just for the assassination, but for preventing a second attempted or successful invasion of Cuba, right? What do you mean by that? Well, for people who don't know Nagel, maybe you can talk about him.
Nagel's an interesting guy.
Yeah.
Okay, so he first, we learn about Nagel first, or at least Nagel's first involvement with Oswald, let me put it that way, is while Oswald is in the Marines at Sugi, Japan. And Oswald looks like he's working undercover, that he is involved with, there's a place called the Queen Bee, like this bar or hangout where there's beautiful Japanese women who cater to American officers, and they're trying to find out information. Somehow one of them latches on to Oswald, but he doesn't have anywhere near the money that it would take to spend time with a woman like this, but he does. So something's going on, and Oswald eventually goes to the Russian embassy in Tokyo, and he wants to talk to a Russian officer named Narashkin. And according to Nagel, he accidentally bumps into Oswald outside the building and sees him and doesn't know what's going on, why he's there. But it doesn't make any sense. Most likely, Nagel was either assigned to follow Oswald, watch Oswald, who was working with Oswald. And I say that because then in 1963, in the spring, Nagel he worked for the CIA. He worked for an organization called FOI. He was a Korean War veteran. FOI was in Southeast Asia, and he's just involved in a lot of different things. And he's a U.S. intelligence operative. And he's working for the CIA in 1963, and they send him to look into anti-Castro Cuban groups in the United States that were very violent, sabotage against Castro, the mainland of Cuba, what have you. But at the time, Kennedy now had put the kibosh on these groups. Post-Cuban Missile Crisis, he wanted to end mongoose. He wanted to stop all these groups from invading Cuba, and realized that there's a lot of sensitivity here. It could motivate the Russians to take West Berlin. It could create a problem in Cuba. He's looking to just diffuse all of this situation. Well, in conjunction with Nagel investigating these groups for the CIA, he also investigates Marina and Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, which is kind of odd, right? Yeah. And so this is like April 1963. So the interesting thing about it is that Nagel would say later that Marina wanted to leave Oswald, which no one other than Nagel has ever really said that. So how he knew that? I mean, now she may very well have wanted to leave him. There's talk about her going back to Moscow, but that was, according to the official record and Marina's testimony, it was Oswald who wanted her to go back, not her. Right. So, but after the assassination, the FBI spent, I think it was 2 or 3 hours interviewing Marina. And so would the FBI sit down with Marina and say, after 10 minutes, realize she knows nothing, they would leave? To sit there for 2-3 hours meant there's more to Marina's story than meets the eye. Now, Nagel took himself out of circulation, just to fast forward to September 1963, 2 months before the assassination. He walked into a bank in, I think it was El Paso, it doesn't matter, someplace in Texas. And he handed a note to the teller, something about, bank robbery, took a couple of shots into the ceiling, put the gun away, and then just sat down. He wanted to be incarcerated. He knew what was going down. And in that same month prior to that, he had told Oswald he's the patsy being set up for this assassination.
Wow.
Okay, now what's interesting is Marina was interviewed by another author years ago. And I can't remember the fellow's name right now, but it's not that important. What is important is that they were talking about, Oswald and what have you, and she said that her husband was not a criminal. Something like he never robbed a bank that day, something like that. Well, the only person we know of who was attempted to rob a bank was Nagel, the guy that the FBI spent 2-3 hours talking to her about. So we wonder, was there some kind of relationship between Nagel and Marina? We don't know. But anyway, so Nagel is in the middle of everything.
Yeah.
Right. And in the summer of 63, he was involved. He had infiltrated Alpha 66 and these groups, and he was in Mexico. And Oswald was allegedly there at the same time. Now, we know Oswald in September was in Mexico City, but there's evidence pointing towards him being in Mexico in the summer of 63 with Miguel and all of these other Cuban exile groups. So
it is remarkable. Like Nagel is also, I think he was in special forces or something going on with maybe Korean War.
That's right.
Just a really remarkable guy. But why do you think that this? So once the killing of Kennedy and the framing of Oswald, that was kind of expiation for the Cuba adventure, like that was it, and that sealed kind of anybody's interest, Mongoose and Harvey and all these other characters, from wanting to go back to Cuba. Is that correct?
Well, I think the CIA themselves, there are a lot of people that thought it wasn't worth the effort, that Southeast Asia is where we should be, that Cuba was not a threat. All right, people say, well, it was whatever it is, 90 miles from the coast of Florida, but it also meant we could keep an eye on it. And it's been 60 years that we've never had one that I know of problem with Cuba. I mean, minor stuff, but I mean, as far as being a major threat to the United States, there's zero in 60 years, right? So anyway, what happened in 1963 was this, and where it all kind of came together. So you had, like I said, JFK's cracking down on these right-wing exile groups who want to launch these sabotage raids against Cuba, try and assassinate Castro, whatever. He's arresting them. He's arresting guys from Alpha 66. He's arresting American mercenaries like Jerry Patrick Hemming, Frank Sturgis, who work with them. And he's just wants to stop that. But meanwhile, has Bobby, his brother, in charge of Operation Amworld, which is an invasion of Cuba. But it's more of a left-wing type Cuban exiles that the Kennedy administration approved of. So, and they're working with the U.S. military. And the idea is that at the end of 1963, at some point, they're looking to do something in Cuba, and they're looking to train Cuban exiles in Nicaragua, and so this is in the works. So now, while this is going on, there's a fellow, Paulino Sierra, comes out of virtually not nowhere, but just. Well, Paulino Sierra was in Batista, who was the president that Castro overthrew, and he worked in his government, and he was more on the right-wing Cuban exile side, and he started putting together a coalition of right-wing Cuban exiles, like in opposition to Amworld. Okay, so now this right-wing coalition is backed by the mafia financially, is backed by oil men, big business, and so their objective is to also invade Cuba, but instead of Amworld. At least that's what it seems like. I think some of the Amworld Cuban exiles were crossing over to be on his side because it was more likely that they didn't trust the Kennedy brothers. So that month, on April 15th, this guy Sierra actually meets with Allen Dulles, who was the ex-CIA director, and retired Army General Lucius Clay, who was at one time in charge of everything in Berlin. He was the architect of the Berlin airlift. And at this time, he's representing a board of directors and what have you, a lot of large corporations. So this group is looking, by the end of the year, to invade Cuba also. And there are members on the right-wing Cuban exiles that are talking about, and they're on record, we'll be in Cuba once we take care of Kennedy. And so it looks like they're thinking about the assassination. Now, there is a group, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Jean-Pierre Lafitte date book, but
the name rings a bell. I don't know the date book,
though. Okay, so Lafitte was this intelligence operative, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, totally no scruples, CIA connected, who has a date book, and it was a friend of mine, Leslie Sharp, and the late Hank Albarelli wrote a book, Coup in Dallas, that highlights this date book. And it is an outline of the assassination plot. Oh, wow. It is a group that, in my opinion, and I think that is where the assassination plot, that's who really killed Kennedy, in my opinion. Okay, and this was a coalition of right-wing fascist people at the CIA, like Angleton, William Harvey, a host of others, Dulles, and monarchists from Europe, and ex-Nazis that they've been working for from the early 1950s, like Otto Skorzeny. And I know it sounds far-fetched, but these people had the same agenda. Basically, protect the West from Russia, contain communism. I mean, American George Kennan had defined the American policy by the policy of containment in the late 1940s, that if you contain Russia from expanding, they will eventually implode because they cannot support themselves economically, and they did eventually implode. But anyway, so this coalition of ex-fascists in Europe, the United States, the OAS, French generals who were revolting against Charles de Gaulle, they looked at Kennedy as a loose cannon, that if he did invade Cuba in any way, Berlin was going to fall. And if Berlin fell, then there was a good chance that that would lead to World War III. And so I think they wanted to change the center of gravity, which is what happened from Cuba to Southeast Asia. And right within 10 months after Kennedy was killed, Gulf of Tonkin incident happened in Vietnam. And next thing you know, that's exactly what happened. Berlin all of a sudden was not such a hot spot as it was. Cuba became really not that important, and everything transferred to Southeast Asia.
Wow, incredible. And what's Scorsese? I mean, we know he was in Spain running kind of a bunch of
Right.
guys after. I mean, how did he make it to becoming involved in the JFK assassination?
Well, Scorsese, Hans Rudel, Gellin, there were these ex-Nazis that, and not to mention others, scientists and what have you, Operation Paperclip, that the United States embraced, CIA and the military. They had a lot of information about the Russians, about their intelligence network, their military capabilities, and so they worked with members of the CIA who were. Remember, a lot of these people were like Harvey was chief of station in Berlin. Angleton was in Italy at the end of World War II. These people were
Dulles was in Switzerland. Close friends of Galen too, personal friends.
That's right, exactly. So these people were really they weren't pro-Nazi, never. But what they did was look at the Nazis or ex-Nazis as they were fascists, but compared to the communists, they were the lesser of two evils. So they were, right from the early 1950s, there were operations that they worked together. And in Madrid is where Scorsese went. You have Charles Willoughby, who was McCarthy's. Right. He was.
That's it. Wow.
Right. So he was McCarthy's intelligence head of intelligence for MacArthur in the Asia during World War II, during the and Korea. So he becomes a big. He was a fascist.
Super hard right, like whatever.
Yeah.
And there's a recent research has connected him to Dallas. November 22nd, 63. There's no question about it. I didn't know that Willoughby was connected to Scorsese.
Well, I don't know if he was directed. He must have been, okay, because he made in the early 1950s. There was a lot going on in Madrid because the United States wanted Spain, or they wanted to put bases in Spain, and they needed Franco's approval. Now Franco was a fascist dictator. And we had no problems with that, right? So Eisenhower was not yet president, but he was over there for something, and he sent William Paulley, right, who's a JFK assassination figure, to Madrid to discuss these bases and what have you with Franco and his people, and eventually he was successful. So he was there. Willoughby was there at the same time, and another guy named Jack Crichton, a Texas oil man, and Clint Murchison, another oil man, were also in Madrid working on a deal with Otto Scorsese directly.
Wow. Okay, see, I never knew that. That's
now Scorsese has his own. He's putting together a 200,000 man army, a Gladio type army, to hold back the Russians, made up not of ex-Nazi collaborators and ex-Nazis from Germany, and so there was a definite justification for these various groups to come together, not with the JFK assassination in mind, but they were all looking to fight to protect Western Europe and fight against communism. Right. And Angleton in Italy, he was like in the middle of everything, right? So
a lot of these guys are Knights of Malta. Do you know that Dulles and Galen are both Knights of Malta?
Yeah. I don't know if Angleton is, but you're right.
I thought I saw him on a list, but I know that those two. Galen, there's a picture of Galen wearing his Maltese cross. So that's probably another tie between these. This is Christian, anti-communist.
Exactly.
Tied in the wool, yeah.
Keep in mind that right after World War II, Italy in particular was really frightened, Pius XII, of
communism
and losing the election to the communists. Yeah. And so that's how kind of Gladio started, and the CIA got involved there, and in France of trying to suppress communism, which they did. And there was just a natural coming together of people like Skorzeny. And they had, you were supposedly denazified, right? If you went through some kind of a program and all of a sudden you're no longer a Nazi.
They washed you, yeah.
Yeah,
Have
exactly.
Have you ever seen clips of Skorzeny's funeral? It looks
Yeah,
like a Nazi march, man.
it
Everybody's
was.
making the
It
salute
wasn't
and all this.
exactly.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, and anyway, the date book has Skorzeny's in there, Rudell's in there, Angleton's in there, Harvey's in there. These names, de Vaugelet, who was an French intelligence guy who was close to the OAS, the generals in Algeria, who revolted against de Gaulle and wanted to overthrow the French government because de Gaulle gave Algeria their independence.
Right.
And these French military guys had been in Vietnam in 1954 when they defeated Dien Bien Phu.
Yeah.
Right. So they were out. They left Vietnam, go to Algeria, and their own government basically betrays them or just they were really nationalistic pro France, and they wanted to make right what went wrong in Vietnam, and they weren't allowed to. So there are stories about like a revolution going on in France, an American plane sitting on runways not letting the people off because of what was happening in Paris in the early 1960s.
How many times did they try to kill de Gaulle? Like,
I don't know if it could be more than a dozen.
yeah, something like that. There were like near misses and all kinds of crazy stuff. And when Kennedy was killed, de Gaulle was like, I know what's going on. It's the same kind of ideas. Yeah.
He did. He said something like, this is an OAS operation. He said,
yeah,
same guys that were trying to get, and they really, I think it was because the CIA was involved with the OAS and they all had the same agenda. Let's get rid of people who we think are weak on communism, and let's promote the type of world order that we want, and let's hold back communism and do what we have to do. So if Cuba fell, and then in response Berlin fell, we would have to retaliate and do something. And so they weren't looking for World War III. They were just looking for contain the spread of communism. Right. And so that's what I think was the number one reason why JFK was assassinated. And in the process of all of it, the date book tells it clearly, Oswald was set up as a patsy, and Oswald knew it at some point. When Oswald, after Nagel told Oswald he was the patsy, he goes to Mexico City, and he tries to get into Havana, Cuba. They won't let him. There's a Russian guy named I'm going to mispronounce it, but Nechaparenko, something like that, who was working at the Russian embassy in Mexico City at the time, and Oswald comes in, and he says he's telling them in tears, you don't understand what I'm going through. Basically, you got to get me to Havana, because I think Oswald knows that he, just like Nagel, who took himself out of harm's way by shooting up the bank, Oswald's thinking the same thing.
Get away from it, right? Yeah.
Then he comes back to the States, and on November 9th, he writes a letter while at Ruth Payne's house. Basically, he writes it to the Russian embassy, and he puts in that letter, I had to leave Mexico because of visa restrictions, and if I stayed, I would have had to use my real name. But I think, and he said, and he mentions another guy, Kostakov, who was another Russian at the embassy in Mexico City, who was something to do with Department 13, which was the Russian assassination squad. So Oswald mentions his name in the letter, but he calls him Kostin by mistake, not Kostakov. And but as soon as the Russians got that, they handed it over to the FBI, and the FBI had it before the assassination. And I think Oswald's he's hoping to get arrested. It's a possibility. I don't know if that's what was happening, but you know the story of how he went into the FBI office and handed in a letter saying, I'm going to blow up your office if you don't stop bothering my wife, to James Hosty, the FBI agent. He seems like he's trying hard to get arrested and take it. He knows what fate has in store for him. and he just can't.
You can't get away from being under their thumb.
Exactly.
Something weird. It's so strange. Yeah.
It is.
They're just surrounding him, holding him. Dear Mohrenschildt and Payne. You know, Payne's best friend was a woman by the name of Bancroft who worked directly under Dulles in Switzerland.
Not just, he was Bancroft was Dulles' mistress.
Yeah, something like that. It's like super close. Yeah, and she's like buddies with Payne. It's unbelievable.
It's how that connection happened is but there's so many of these so-called coincidences that happen that they just defy logic. That you put them all together, it's just impossible that there isn't some kind of backstory to all of this.
Right. I mean, but it goes back to Europe. It goes back to Berlin. I mean, it definitely is part of this. All these guys are overlapping. The guy who did the Berlin airlift, whatever you mentioned.
Lucius
Clay. Like in Willoughby, you can't leave Willoughby out of this. I don't know if you've heard of James Day, but he traced it was kind of a laundry truck. Like it looks totally innocuous, but the ownership tied back to Willoughby, the laundry truck in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963 was a holding company owned by Willoughby. Like, wow. Like
stuff.
Yeah. Like, I mean, it just, you get more and more pieces of the puzzle. And one of the Nagel book, I forgot who the author was, but the title of the book is perfect, which is The Man Who Knew Too Much, right?
Oh, Dick Russell's book.
Dick Russell, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah.
And so I mean, it's the thing that always bothered me and how I got again with this Berlin angle is why didn't we invade Cuba after the assassination? Because here's what we knew about Oswald, right? We knew he defected to Russia. We knew he was, let's forget what we know today. Think about 1963. We know he defected to Russia. We know he was a communist. Comes back to the United States. He contacts the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a pro-Castro group. Right. He moves from Dallas to New Orleans, and he's arrested. But he starts handing out flyers on the street, pro-Castro flyers. He gets arrested in that Carlos Bringuer incident and winds up going to court over it for an altercation related to handing out pro-Castro information. He gets onto a radio somehow. The guy is only 23 years old, right? So
yeah, dead at 24. Unbelievable life for such a young person. Yeah.
Exactly. So he gets onto this debate with Ed Butler and Bringuer, where they expose him as a communist on the radio in New Orleans. He again gets videotaped handing out these flyers again. He goes to Mexico City. We know that he tried to get, and they knew it at the time, tried to get to Havana, Cuba. He writes that letter that I described to you about talking about using his real name if he stayed in Mexico City, so he had to come home. He drops off something saying he's going to blow up the FBI building. Then when he's dead, they measure him. They find out he's 5'9", and Oswald is 5'11". This bothered Richard Helms of the CIA so much that he wanted to exhume Oswald's body to see who was really buried there, and they shot him down.
But so that eventually happened. Didn't he eventually get
years later? Yeah. There's a guy named Eddowes who wrote a book about Oswald and the height discrepancies, and he got a hold of Marina, and they did exhume the body. And it turned out to be Oswald there, because I think it was always the same guy. The 5'11", 5'9" was not a change, but whatever. But anyway, getting back to my point though, all of this information they had about Oswald, Cuba, defection, connections to Castro potentially, they had handed to them on a silver platter what they had wanted to do since the day Castro took over in Cuba on January 1st, 1959. They could have invaded, they could have killed Castro, they could have gotten rid of him, and they would have been justified in doing so. Okay, they could have gone to the Organization of American States in South America and Central America. Here's why we have to do this. Here's the evidence. No one would have criticized them for doing it, and they did nothing. So there had to be a reason they did nothing. And I think the reason is Berlin, that there was more to this. They realized there was more to this than just little Oswald. And so they let that go. The Warren Commission then was called in to not tell us the truth, but to just hide the truth and just whitewash the whole thing and just blame Oswald as the lone assassin.
Yep.
10 months later, we're in Vietnam, and then we're there until what, 1972 or thereabouts.
Yeah, almost 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
A disaster too, just a catastrophe. Catastrophe for the U.S. also for the Vietnamese, really Southeast Asia actually, but Vietnam and just
Cambodia, Laos, the whole region.
Yeah.
I mean, and even if you go back to the Korean War, we basically destroyed Seoul.
The whole place was just like every building was blown away in Korea or some crazy stat. Like
exactly
bombed and nothing.
Exactly, but they were, this is collateral damage. The key was to just contain the spread of communism, and people get hurt in the process. Well, you had generals throughout the Cold War, 50s and early 60s, admitting that we're going to bomb with nuclear weapons Russia. And yes, we understand that 10 million Americans are going to die, but that's just the price we're going to have to pay.
Right. They're thinking about that today, too. It's crazy. It's Dr. Strangelove all over again.
It is. There are people who look at it and say, you know what, we might as well, if we can get in the first shot, we're going to pay the price, but in the long run, we'll be better off. And I don't.
It's just, they're talking about destroying a whole country, tens of millions of people. It's off the charts.
It's off the charts. Exactly. That anyone would even, it's you have to be insane.
Yeah, it's madness. It's great to talk with you again, Walter. Congrats on the new book. People check it out. Where can people find Last Resort Beyond Last Resort?
Well, they can go Amazon. Amazon's a place. Goodreads. Trying Day Publishing is a publisher. You can buy it from direct from there.
There's a Kindle version.
There's a paperback and a Kindle version. Yes.
It's perfect time before Father's Day. If people out there, your dad wants something to read, buy this book. You can get it shipped straight to him right off of Amazon. So
yes,
check
sir.
it out. And the best. Go ahead.
No, if you want, people can follow me if they want on Facebook at Walter Herbst Author.
Cool. I'll put a link to that.
I post a lot on Reddit, which /Walter Herbst. And
your website is herbstbooks.com, and that's contact too. So you can be contacted on Reddit, Facebook, and at your website.
You can email me at walter@herbstbooks.com.
Walter@herbstbooks. Thanks again for your time. It's great to talk with you again. The full title of the just published book is Last Resort Beyond Last Resort: The JFK Assassination, the Need to Protect West Berlin, and Why a Second Invasion of Cuba Never Happened. And it's Walter, Herbst. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, William. It was great to be with you.
Yeah, thanks. Stay there.